A word of caution. This episode contains descriptions of sexual assault and murder. Please take care when listening. When people find out I have a true crime podcast, it often sparks discussions of related cold cases and serial killers. I'm asked, have you written about this or done a podcast about that? Most of the time, I'm familiar with the topics and have usually covered them, but I know not everyone has listened to 100+ episodes of this podcast. And even if they have, I started the show 4 years ago, and a lot of content and crime has been covered since then. Because of that, I wanted to pull together pieces of several scripts I've produced and focus solely on sharing information about 4 notorious serial killers with you today. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 128, 4 North Carolina Serial Killers. What I find interesting about all of these men is how different their personalities were. 2 of these men I'm going to talk about today were just brutally violent and murdered a variety of women who crossed their paths. There was no rhyme or reason. They were mostly motivated by opportunity. And the other 2 perpetrators put on a facade, the I'm a sweet and caring guy trick that worked for a long time because even people in their innermost circles wouldn't have suspected them of the violent crimes they participated in. First, I want to talk about Terry Alvin Hyatt. I discussed Hyatt in episode 26, Missing Moms in North Carolina. It took many years for Hyatt's crimes to catch up with him. The first one occurred in the late 1970s. The following homicide victims were eventually linked to Hyatt. Harriet Delaney Simmons was a 40-year-old mother of 7 when she went missing on April 15, 1979. She left her job on Capitol Boulevard in Raleigh with plans to drive straight through the night to visit with friends in Nashville, Tennessee. She never arrived at her destination. Her kids knew something had to be wrong because she would have called home if she had run into any problems during the drive. About a week later, investigators found Harriet's abandoned car at a rest stop along I-40 in Iredell County, which would have been about 4 hours from her home in Raleigh. Her suitcase was still in the car, along with a thermos of food that had belonged to Harriet. A year later, skeletal remains with the markings of stab wounds were found in the Pisgah National Forest outside of Asheville. They were eventually identified as belonging to Harriet Simmons. In August of 1979, 21-year-old Betty Sue McConnell left her job at a restaurant on Tunnel Road in Asheville and told her mother she planned to meet friends at a local bowling alley. Instead, several hours later, a couple that lived close to the French Broad River heard screams and saw a soaking wet Betty Sue stumble towards them. She managed to tell them she'd been stabbed and thrown into the river. She later died from her injuries, leaving behind a 2-year-old daughter. Initially, investigators had no leads on who could have murdered these 2 women, nor did they pinpoint that there could have been a connection. It wasn't until a man named Jerry Harmon told investigators in Asheville in 1999 that he'd been with a friend named Terry Hyatt the night Betty Sue McConnell was killed, and that he couldn't keep the secret bottled up inside him any longer. During the murder trial of Harriet Simmons and Betty Sue McConnell, more details came to light. According to an article I found in the Asheville Citizen-Times, a friend of Hyatt's named Lester Dean Helms told police he was with Hyatt when they abducted a woman from a rest area off I-40, sexually assaulted her, and then robbed her. He claimed he did not know if Hyatt had murdered Harriet. He had only seen her walk into a wooded area and Terry return with blood on his shirt. The article didn't mention the location of where this final sighting of Harriet was. A jury convicted Hyatt of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Harriet Simmons and Betty Sue McConnell in January of 2000, and he is now on death row. But the story of the pain that Terry Hyatt brought to North Carolina families did not end there, as there are more layers to the story. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department established their first cold case squad in 2003. One of the cases they looked at first was the 1987 murder of a 19-year-old young woman named Jerry Ann Jones. Jones was working as a cashier at a Harris Teeter grocery store in Charlotte, and she disappeared while waiting for her boyfriend to pick her up from work on July 8, 1987. 2 days later, police found her nude body about a mile away from her place of employment. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed, but the case quickly went cold. When the cold case unit started examining the evidence in Jerry's case, they discovered a cigarette butt near the body along with semen found on the body. The DNA evidence matched Terry Hyatt, and he ended up confessing to her murder in 2005. He pled guilty and received a life sentence in exchange for his confession. There is another woman, Carolyn Brigman, who also had a run-in with Hyatt, but survived the ordeal. Prosecutors called her to testify in Hyatt's murder trial for Harriet Simmons and Betty Sue McConnell. Carolyn was a 40-year-old mother of 5 who worked the late shift at a donut shop on Patton Avenue in Asheville. One night in October of 1979, she finished her shift at 2 a.m., only to find that her car wouldn't start. Because she lived in an apartment complex not too far away, she decided to make the walk home. Hyatt appeared at that moment and forced her to get into his truck, threatening her with a knife. As he drove her past a nearby river, she tried to distract him by commenting how pretty it was. His reply, "I've put a lot of bodies there." He parked and asked her to get undressed. She told him that she didn't want to do that he was a nice young man, and she was an older woman with children. For reasons unknown to Carolyn, he set the knife he was holding down and said, "I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to give you back your life." He dropped her back off where he had found her and threatened that if she ever told anyone what had happened, he would find her, cut her up into little pieces, and throw her in the river. Carolyn Brigman didn't let Hyatt's threats intimidate her, though. She reported him to the police, and he pled guilty to armed robbery and kidnapping. At the time, investigators had no idea he had already murdered the 2 women in the months prior. Harry Hyatt remains on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh. He is 67 years old. Next, I want to talk about John Wayne Boyer, who I first wrote about in episode 39. It took law enforcement several years to fully comprehend the amount of crimes he had participated in, because he frequently traveled across state lines. It was the murder of a woman named Scarlett Wood, who initially remained unidentified after her death, that first led investigators to Boyer. The television show Forensic Files featured Scarlett Wood's story on season 13, episode 6, titled About Face. The documentary show shared how UNC Wilmington professor Dr. Midori Albert, a forensic anthropologist, and a team of student volunteers collected the bones found on the property in Wilmington in 2004. They were able to estimate the victim was female and measured about 5 feet 4 inches tall. The bones told the story of a violent death. The woman had a broken nose, broken ribs, and had been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen. There was no clothing found with the victim. Investigators theorized the killer was local because the area the remains were found in were off the beaten path. The tenant who discovered the remains had only been living in the rental home where the remains were found a short time, so he was ruled out as a suspect. Investigators worked to identify who the victim was. They looked over missing persons records to see who had been reported missing during the time frame the murder must have occurred. Scarlett Wood's name came up, and they discovered she'd been heading to a party at a local motel the night she went missing in 2003. Unfortunately, the only dental records Scarlett had were more than 10 years old, and the bones discovered were too dried out to extract DNA. Stumped, they consulted with Dr. Albert at UNC Wilmington once again. She knew there was a procedure called skull photo video superimposition, where you take a photograph of a person and blend it over the photo of a skull in order to blend the 2 images together. This helps pinpoint any similarities between the 2 images. But the university didn't have the technology needed to perform the procedure, and at the time, it would have cost more than $30,000 to obtain it. Dr. Midori turned to her husband, Shane Baptista, who served as a computing consultant at the university, to see if he had any ideas of how to mimic the skull photo video superimposition. Baptista found a free program called GIMP, or GNU Image Manipulation Program. It is a program similar to Adobe Photoshop. He took a photo of Scarlett and superimposed it over an image of the skull of the unidentified murder victim. They had a match. A test of DNA found inside the pulp of one of Scarlett's teeth helped seal the identification. The police interviewed the tenants who would have been living at the rental property during the time Scarlett was murdered and cleared them in the investigation, as they didn't seem to have any ties to her. No physical evidence of a crime was found inside the home. Investigators next talked to a few friends of Scarlett's, learning she had stayed behind after the motel party to hang out with a man named John Wayne Boyer, who was 46 at the time. Boyer was a long-haul truck driver who told them Scarlett had decided to walk home after the party. They were a little doubtful at first, because the night had been a frigid 17 degrees, and Scarlett's friends said she had no more than a light jacket with her. But Scarlett and Boyer knew each other because she had babysat his girlfriend's kids in the past, and they had no physical evidence Boyer had been involved in a crime. A search of the hotel room turned up no leads, but it had been repainted and redecorated after Scarlett went missing. A search of Boyer's van that he owned at the time Scarlett was murdered turned up no blood evidence. He also had no criminal record that anyone knew of at that point. But police kept interrogating him, and he finally confessed, admitting to assaulting Scarlett after a sexual encounter in the motel room. He tried to say she accidentally hit her head on a piece of furniture inside the room, and then he left her body in the woods. But Dr. Midori said the evidence left behind on Scarlett's remains showed a more violent attack and stabbing must have occurred. John Wayne Boyer pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2007 and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. What the North Carolina investigators didn't know was that John Wayne Boyer's occupation had put him in the path of several other unsolved murders. An article in the Daily Herald in Tennessee described how a state employee had discovered a deceased female in an empty parking lot off Interstate 40 in Hickman County in April of 2005. The woman was not clothed, and she had no ID. She was eventually identified as 25-year-old Jennifer Smith from Bucksnort, Tennessee. In December 2007, a match between John Wayne Boyer's DNA and evidence found on Jennifer's body confirmed his involvement in Jennifer's murder. Boyer had stopped at a truck stop in Denmark, Tennessee, met Jennifer, and after a sexual encounter in his truck, the two had an argument that resulted in her death. Boyer's sentence in North Carolina was up in 2017, and he was convicted of Jennifer Smith's murder in Tennessee and sentenced to 30 years in prison. There's another victim who was known as the I-20 girl after her body was discovered in the woods near an I-20 rest stop in Darlington County, South Carolina in 2000. She had been strangled and was eventually buried in a grave in Hartsville, South Carolina. The headstone read, "Known only by God." It took more than 10 years, but in 2011, investigators held a press conference announcing the victim had been confirmed by DNA to be 33-year-old Michelle Hagedorn. Michelle had gone missing in the summer of 2000, and her family knew the mother of 2 young children had become addicted to drugs and frequently worked as a prostitute. They also mentioned John Wayne Boyer would be arrested for the crime. But in April of 2015, charges had still not been filed in the case. A local news station, WIS News, ran a special report about Michelle. When interviewed by the station, Fourth Circuit Solicitor Will Rogers said there wasn't enough evidence in the case to bring charges against John Boyer. Captain Andy Locklear had questioned Boyer while he was incarcerated in a North Carolina prison for the murder of Scarlett Wood. He admitted to murdering Michelle, who he had picked up at a truck stop, and said he strangled her with his t-shirt. But Michelle had been found with barbed wire wrapped around her neck, so the evidence didn't completely line up. 4 years later, Captain Locklear resigned from his position after being accused by the local sheriff of failing to follow procedure and attempting to cover up what he had failed to do, which was collect evidence in the case and bring up Boyer on charges of Michelle's murder. Michelle's family is upset that Boyer was never charged and tried in the case, and they worry that her case wasn't handled appropriately because she was considered a high-risk victim. The Q Center, or Community United Effort for Missing Persons, put together a blog featuring John Wayne Boyer, his confirmed victims, and unsolved cases that may be connected to him. On the site, the mission of the blog says the following. The project is called Long Haul Territory Killer. We hope to combine all the cases we have firsthand knowledge of, compiled together with existing case facts, interviews, and information gathered over the years in reference to any links to Boyer. Long Haul Territory Killer also has an article featured on the blog describing 10 serial-killing long-haul truckers. In April 2009, a reporter named Scott Glover wrote a comprehensive article for the Los Angeles Times titled, FBI Makes a Connection Between Long-Haul Truckers, Serial Killings. Glover wrote, the federal authorities first made the connection between these two around 2004, when they began tracking a string of unsolved murders along Interstate 40 in Oklahoma and other states. This is when the FBI developed the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. In the first 4 years of its existence, this program helped identify and arrest 10 different men who are believed to be responsible for more than 30 deaths. John Wayne Boyer is now a part of this list. Authorities who have interviewed John Boyer say he also admitted to killing a suspected prostitute in North Carolina. There are 4 women who have possible connections to John Boyer, and 2 of them are from North Carolina. The first one is 32-year-old Madeline Cox Thomas, who went missing from Gaston County in July 1990. At the time her husband reported her missing, he suspected she was involved in drug use and prostitution. She was also known to disappear for days at a time. A few months after her disappearance, a woman walking her dog near I-85 in Spartanburg, South Carolina, found human remains in the grass. The remains were missing the skull, feet, and one hand. Nothing else was ever found. In 2013, after DNA from the bones was sent to a lab at the University of North Texas, the remains were identified as Madeline Cox Thomas. She had been a mother of 2 before her children were placed into foster care around the time she went missing. Her husband had passed away in 1998. Investigators said in a report featured on news station WYFF that around the time Madeline went missing, 3 witnesses reported seeing a man going into the woods with a woman and then coming back out without her. They gave a vehicle description to police. I have to say, based on what I've read, I'm not sure Madeline is one of John Boyer's victims. The timeline is a little earlier than when he reportedly began murdering women, and she didn't go missing from a known truck stop as far as I can tell. Anyone with information on the murder of Madeline Cox Thomas in July of 1990 is asked to call Crime Stoppers at 888-CRIME-SC. Another possible victim is 26-year-old Rose Marie Millette, who went missing from Wilmington in 2001. About a year later, she was found wrapped in a blanket in an industrial area. The back of her skull had been crushed. An article that ran in the Associated Press described John Wayne Boyer as a very large man with a deep hatred for women. He appeared to have a very short fuse when any woman attempted to argue with him. He weighed almost 300 pounds when he entered the North Carolina prison system in 2007, but he targeted victims who were much smaller and more frail than he was. He spoke with disdain about victims he was questioned about, and even his attorney in Scarlett Wood's case said he felt uneasy around his client. On June 29, 2023, John Wayne Boyer died while still incarcerated in a Tennessee prison. He was 66 years old. Next, I'd like to talk about Lesley Eugene Warren. I first discussed this killer in episode 78. He was incredibly young, and he had the face to match. But underneath his youthful demeanor lay the heart of a killer. Women were inherently drawn to him and trusted him. Although 2 of Lesley Eugene Warren's crimes took place in my home state of North Carolina, including places that I lived, I somehow had not heard of him until several years ago. While Warren was eventually captured and incarcerated here in North Carolina, he is known to have had victims in multiple states. Here is some backstory on Lesley Eugene Warren. He was born in Candler, North Carolina, and based on information that came out in his criminal trials, grew up in an abusive household. While in 8th grade, he broke into a cousin's home and was sent to the local juvenile evaluation center. A year later, counselors sent him to Broughton Hospital, a psychiatric hospital in Morganton, because they feared he would attempt suicide. Lesley began to show signs of being troubled as a young child after his parents divorced. He spent 33 days enrolled at Inca High School in 1983, but he only attended 10 of those days before school officials withdrew him. While at Inca High School, a few weeks before his 16th birthday, he tied up a neighbor in her home and held her at gunpoint. A friend happened to stop by and help rescue the woman. This incident sent Warren back to the Juvenile Evaluation Center. He first met a young woman named Jamie Hurley there. She had a psychology degree from UNC Asheville. According to her coworkers, she enjoyed her job and connecting with the teens there, including cooking holiday dinners for them. She thought Warren was a bright young man, even if he was a loner. He liked to read, and they would discuss books. Jamie later left the job after experiencing burnout, but she stayed in touch with Warren on a platonic basis. She even gave him her telephone number. He eventually earned his GED and enlisted in the United States Army when he was 18. He married a woman he had met in South Carolina and was stationed in Fort Drum, New York in 1987. Through a fellow soldier, he became acquainted with a 20-year-old young woman named Patsy Vineyard. Her husband reported her missing on May 21st, 1987, after he returned home from being out of town and couldn't find her. Patsy's body was later found in Lake Ontario near her home in Sackett's Harbor, New York. She had been strangled to death. Warren was one of 150 soldiers who were questioned in her disappearance, but he wasn't charged at the time of her death. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army after receiving convictions for larceny and unauthorized absences, returning back to North Carolina and becoming a truck driver. The woman Warren had met at the Juvenile Evaluation Center, Jamie Denise Hurley, was 39 years old when she went missing from her home in Asheville on May 25, 1990. A friend of Jamie's knew Warren had been at Jamie's home the day before she went missing and grew concerned when she couldn't reach her friend. Warren had reached out to Jamie and said he needed her help, and she invited him over. Investigators tracked Warren down a few days later to question him about Jamie Hurley. He let them search his white van at the police department, and they found a purse belonging to Jamie inside. Warren told police he thought he needed to retain a lawyer, and they talked amongst themselves and decided Jamie might still be alive. However, despite asking for an attorney, they continued questioning Warren. During the course of that investigation, he told police that Jamie had died from a cocaine overdose, and he had put her body into the French Broad River. According to Jamie's friends and family, she was not known to use cocaine. The police arrested Lesley Warren for failure to produce a title for a motor vehicle and misdemeanor larceny of Jamie Hurley's purse. The district attorney was not ready to file additional charges related to Jamie's disappearance at that point, so Warren was released on a $25,000 secured bond. He returned back to the police department on June 7, 1990, to try and get his van back. Investigators asked him to give blood, hair, and urine samples, which he agreed to. They asked if he could return the next day to tell them more about Jamie's alleged overdose, and he agreed to. However, instead, his mother and his lawyer's private investigator left messages for the police stating that his attorney needed to be present for any future interviews. Ted Lambert, who was then a detective with the Asheville Police Department, had been conducting informational interviews with people who knew Warren from South Carolina. That's when he learned his suspect had been a suspect in yet another woman's murder. In August 1989, the body of 42-year-old Thelma Faye Gray from Travelers Rest, South Carolina, was found by fishermen in Lake Bowen, not far from her home. Her hands were tied behind her back. She had died of asphyxiation. It appeared she had wrecked her car earlier that evening before she went missing. Thelma was a singer in a band called Reflections and had been returning home from a gig in Asheville so she could help her son get ready for college. Her car was later found in a remote section of Greenville County. The left side of the vehicle had sustained damage. The passenger window was down, the gas tank lid was open, and the license tag was missing. Police initially arrested a young man for stealing Velma's car, a Mazda RX-7, and moving it to a secondary location after finding it abandoned. They later determined Velma was already gone from the scene when the car was stolen. In an article that ran in the Greenville News on December 15, 1989, the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office announced Velma's family was offering a reward of $3,000 for anyone who knew of a truck driver that was at the scene when Velma wrecked her car off the White Horse Road extension. Witnesses said they saw a tractor-trailer parked near Velma's car early on August 27th. Police wondered if someone had stopped to offer the woman help. They wanted to see if this truck driver had any additional information. They later questioned Lesley Eugene Warren when they learned he was a truck driver who might have been in the area, and he said he had not stopped that night in South Carolina. In July of 1990, after being questioned in Jamie Hurley's disappearance, and while out on bond, Warren traveled to High Point, North Carolina. According to a news article that ran later that month, a young woman named Terry Quinby, who worked part-time as a bartender at a local hotel, met Lesley Eugene Warren and took him as her guest to a company picnic. She introduced him to a coworker, Katherine Johnson, a 21-year-old college student at the University of North Carolina, and the two hit it off. The group went to a local Applebee's after the picnic, and Warren bragged to Terry's brother that he planned to make a move on Katherine later that evening. He and Katherine later left the restaurant so he could give the young woman a ride on his motorcycle. Around 11:30 p.m., Warren returned to pick up Katherine's car. She was not with him, and he told Terry that she was at a local motel where they would be spending the night. The next day, he returned alone to Terry Quinby's house and asked her if he could stay there for a while he looked for a new place. He said Katherine had returned to Chapel Hill. Lesley proceeded to spend the entire week at Terry's house before he was arrested for Jamie Hurley's disappearance. When he was arrested, he had a set of keys on him that belonged to Katherine Johnson. After he was detained by the officers with the Asheville Police Department, he confessed to being responsible for the murder of Katherine Johnson. He revealed the two had been intimate on the night they met, and then he had strangled her with her bra and left her body in the trunk of her car in the Radisson Hotel parking deck. Then he buried her in a shallow grave off Highway 151 in western Buncombe County. Katherine's family had been out of town and hadn't even known the young woman was missing when investigators discovered her body. Warren was eventually tied to the deaths of Patsy Vineyard from New York and Velma Gray from South Carolina. After Warren was arrested in High Point, Terry Quinby told local media outlets that, "What freaks me out is that I could have been next. I mean, they say he knew all those girls too. It's so hard to believe. He was so normal." It's hard to know why Lesley Eugene Warren committed these murders. Most of the time his victims were women he knew personally, except for Velma Gray, which seemed to be a crime of opportunity. But why did he murder some women and remain in relationships with others? What was his thought process? At the time of his arrest, Lesley Eugene Warren had a wife he was separated from and a child in South Carolina. He was not tried for Patsy Vineyard's murder. He received a life sentence for killing Velma Gray from South Carolina and was sentenced to death in North Carolina for the murders of Jamie Denise Hurley and Katherine Johnson. Lesley Eugene Warren is currently on death row. He is suspected of murdering other women as well. The next serial killer I want to talk about, Henry Louis Wallace, is probably the most prolific here in North Carolina. I shared the story of his crime spree in episode 89. In the early 1990s, a string of rapes and murders occurred in East Charlotte. Because the killer used different methods and cleaned up crime scenes, investigators had no idea the murders were connected until he escalated and got sloppy, stealing items from the victims and leaving evidence behind. Community members became convinced the murders went unsolved because they involved working-class Black women, many of whom were young mothers. But when the suspect was arrested, friends and family were devastated to learn it was a person they had known and trusted all along, someone who blended into their community and took advantage of the kindness of others. What was Charlotte like in the 1990s? It was experiencing a surge of growth in the job market, with 14,000 new jobs created in 1994, while also earning recognition as the third largest banking center in the United States. But alongside economic growth in 1993, Charlotte-Mecklenburg experienced more than 9,000 instances of violent crime, with 87 murders, 350 rapes, 2,713 robberies, and almost 6,000 assaults, according to a comprehensive report on this case written by Joseph Geringer. But despite the industry growth in Charlotte at the time, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department was not equipped or prepared for the onslaught of vicious crimes brought on by a serial killer. In the mid-1990s, the department only had 7 full-time investigators employed. That number has more than tripled since then. The crimes of Henry Louis Wallace varied in modus operandi, with him often cleaning up the murder scenes, and because different investigators were assigned to each one, the cases went unlinked for some time. The other thing that baffled investigators is that the crimes did not seem random. For example, in the cases of the women murdered in their homes and with their children present, there were no signs of forced entry. It seemed the victims knew who their murderer was and even trusted him. So did their families. In one case, Wallace consoled the mother of one of his victims and attended the funerals of others. The department did eventually seek help from the FBI in early 1994. But when Henry Louis Wallace was arrested, he didn't match the profile of the serial killer the FBI was looking for, because they believed most serial killers were white men who killed strangers. Wallace was a black man who was connected to each of the victims. In fact, many of them had dated him or called him a friend. Here's an overview of the victims and circumstances in which they were found. Later, I'll get into these in more detail because Wallace shared a lot with police during his confession in March of 1994. In March of 1990, an 18-year-old high school student in Barnwell, South Carolina, was murdered and left in a local pond. Her body was found on April 1st. In May of 1992, 33-year-old Sharon Nance, whose family said she had fallen on hard times and become addicted to drugs, was found murdered near Roselle's Ferry Road in Charlotte. Her body was discovered on May 27th of that year. In June of 1992, 20-year-old Caroline Love went missing from the apartment she shared with her roommate, Sadie McKnight. Her boss at the Bojangles on Central Avenue became concerned when she didn't show up for work and alerted her family. On February 19, 1993, 20-year-old Central Piedmont Community College student Shauna Hawk was discovered deceased in the bathtub of the home she shared with her mother. She had been raped and strangled before being put in the water. On June 22, 1993, 24-year-old Audrey Spain was found raped and murdered in her home. Her cause of death was strangulation. On August 10, 1993, firefighters responded to a fire at the apartment complex of Valencia Jumper, a 21-year-old computer science major at Johnson C. Smith University. It appeared she had left a pot of boiling water on the stove and fallen asleep, but she was later determined to be the victim of a homicide. On September 14, 1993, 20-year-old Michelle Stinson, a college student at Central Piedmont Community College and mother of 2 sons, was raped, strangled, and stabbed to death in her home. Her 2 young sons were present at the time of her murder. On February 20th, 1994, 25-year-old Vanessa Mack was strangled in her West Charlotte apartment. Her 4-month-old infant daughter was left alive on the couch during the attack. On March 9th, 1994, 24-year-old Betty Baucom was raped and strangled in her apartment, which was also burglarized. Later on the evening of March 9th, Brandy Henderson, who lived in the same apartment complex as Betty Baucom, was raped and strangled. Her 10-month-old infant son was also home at the time, and he was found with a towel wrapped around his neck. The child survived the attack. On March 12, 1994, 35-year-old Deborah Ann Slaughter was raped and stabbed in her home. It was after Betty Baucom's murder in March of 1994 that police felt like the killer had gotten sloppy and made a series of errors that would help lead to his identity. He had stolen Baucom's television and VCR, so they dispatched officers to check at local pawn shops for the items. Her aqua-colored Nissan Pulsar was also missing, so they put out an alert to look for the car. Less than 24 hours later, Brandy Henderson's boyfriend, Furnace Woods, had found her body and their infant, who was still alive in the apartment. It was clear that Charlotte had a killer on its hands that was escalating in behavior. When Sergeant Gary McFadden, who is now the sheriff of Mecklenburg County, met with the squad early the next morning to assess the details of the crimes and compare notes, they discovered that Betty Baucom and Brandy Henderson did not appear to know one another, despite living in the same complex. However, when they interviewed the friends and family of all the victims they knew about up to that point and looked through the lists of acquaintances for the women, one name appeared frequently: 28-year-old Henry Louis Wallace. They began to realize Shauna Hawk and Audrey Spain had both worked at Taco Bell under Wallace. Michelle Stinson had visited the Taco Bell and talked with Wallace while she ate. Valencia Jumper was friends with Wallace's sister Yvonne. Vanessa Mack had dated Wallace. Betty Baucom was a friend of Wallace's girlfriend, Sadie McKnight. Brandy Henderson's boyfriend, Furnace Woods, was friends with Wallace. Woods mentioned Wallace had often visited Brandy in their apartment while he was on the night shift. And Caroline Love, who had been missing since 1992, had been the roommate of Wallace's girlfriend, Sadie McKnight. Police questioned McKnight about her boyfriend's possible involvement with the murders. She was surprised at first, but then remembered he had been giving her gifts of jewelry like bracelets, rings, and necklaces during the time period of the murders. These pieces had belonged to the victims. Then, Betty Baucom's Nissan Pulsar was found abandoned. When it was dusted for fingerprints, ones located on the lid of the trunk matched Henry Louis Wallace. He had finally gotten sloppy and left evidence behind that could implicate him. Once confronted with the evidence, it didn't take Wallace long to confess. He said that most of his crimes were sexually motivated, but he did steal from the victims to help support his meth habit. It was during his confession that the police realized Caroline Love wasn't actually missing. She was dead. He said he'd taken the key to the apartment from his girlfriend Sadie McKnight, who was Caroline's roommate. He waited until McKnight wouldn't be home and hid in the apartment bathroom until Caroline came home from work. He surprised her, propositioning her for sex, and when she refused, he put her in a chokehold and sexually assaulted her. When she fought back, he strangled her with the cord of a curling iron that was near the bed. He then wrapped her in a bedsheet, put her in a large plastic bag, and took her body to a construction area near Stevenson Road in Charlotte. Shauna Hawk's murder was different. He had stopped by her house to chat with her after she got home from school. But when she teased him about an argument he'd had with his girlfriend, he said he snapped and put a chokehold on her until she passed out. Then he placed her body in the full bathtub to cover up any evidence before stealing money out of her purse. He visited Audrey Spain with the plan to rob her, and because they were friends, she let him in. They smoked a joint together, and then he pinned her to the floor, asking her how much money was in the apartment. He then raped and murdered her, leaving her apartment with a gas card and a Visa card he had stolen out of her purse. With Valencia Jumper, who police had first suspected died in a house fire, Wallace stopped by her apartment saying he needed to talk after an argument with his girlfriend Sadie McKnight. Once there, he sexually assaulted her and choked her when she turned her back to him. He went into the kitchen, put a can of pork and beans on the stove, turning the burner on high. He took the batteries out of the smoke detector and poured alcohol on Valencia's body before lighting a match. He dropped in on Michelle Stinson with the sole purpose of sexually assaulting her. After asking for a glass of water, he attacked her from behind, choking her and then stabbing her with a knife from her kitchen when she continued to make noise. He visited Vanessa Mack because he knew she had a good job, money in the bank, and a debit card he could use. After demanding she hand those things over to him, he sexually assaulted her in the bedroom, leaving her infant daughter asleep on the couch in the living room. When Max said she needed to put her daughter to bed, he strangled her to death, leaving the child unharmed after he left the apartment. Mac also had another daughter who was staying with her grandmother that night. When Wallace visited Betty Baucom at her home, he knew she was a manager at Bojangles and had access to the alarm and safe. Instead of asking her for those things, he sexually assaulted her first and then grew angry when she fought back, strangling her. He stole jewelry, her television and VCR, and her car. He went straight from Betty Balcom's apartment to the one where he knew Brandy Henderson would be alone with her infant. He told her he needed to drop something off for her boyfriend, Furnace Woods, and she believed him. Once inside, he asked her for money, growing angry when she only had $15. He overpowered and raped her before strangling her. He had intended to steal Brandy's television, but her infant son started crying, and Wallace was afraid neighbors would come check on the noise. He tried to quiet the baby with a pacifier, and when that didn't work, he took a towel and tied it around the boy's neck. Just enough, he said, to make it hard for the baby to breathe. Then he left the apartment. When he went to visit his final victim, Deborah Slaughter, he told her he wanted them to go in together to buy drugs. She said she didn't have money for that, and he grew enraged, raping her while holding a towel to her throat. She told him she had been suspicious that he was the person strangling all the women on their side of town, breaking free from his grasp. As she was attempting to run from him, while grabbing a small dagger out of her purse, he took it from her and stabbed her with it before she could escape. During his confessions, Wallace also admitted to murdering Tashonda Bethea in South Carolina, leaving her body in the pond afterward. He also confessed to murdering a prostitute he had sex with in 1992. He tried to refuse to pay her, and she grew angry and combative. He said he beat her to death in self-defense before leaving her body off Old Mount Holly Road. That victim was Sharon Nance. He bragged about using a move called the Boston chokehold to overpower the victims. He said that after raping them, he would give them the impression that they would be safe, and then surprise them with the move. He said that with some of the victims, he turned down the thermostats in their homes to slow down decomposition and confuse investigators about the time of death. Wallace said the ghosts of his victims sometimes spoke to him in his dreams. At one point during his confession, Wallace said, "There's the good Henry, and then there's the bad Henry." And as the years progressed, the bad Henry took over. What a lot of Wallace's friends and acquaintances didn't know was that he had a criminal history dating back to 1988. He was arrested for burglary in Bremerton, Washington, while he was serving in the Navy. He pleaded guilty to second-degree burglary and received 38 days in jail and 24 months parole in Washington. In April 1990, after he had moved back to his hometown of Barnwell, South Carolina, he was questioned about the disappearance of Tashonda Bethea when she first went missing. After her body was found, he was charged with the attempted rape of a 16-year-old girl and entered a program normally reserved for first-time nonviolent offenders. In February of 1991, he was charged with larceny and third-degree burglary after breaking into Barnwell High School and stealing CDs from a radio station where he worked. He served 4 months in a South Carolina state prison and was then released on probation for 3 years. Despite violations, his probation was never revoked. In February 1992, he was charged with the kidnap and rape of a 17-year-old girl. An article that ran in the March 17, 1994 issue of the Charlotte Observer stated that Wallace's probation officer in Charlotte reported that he had failed to check in regularly. They alerted the South Carolina probation officials, who said they hadn't received any reports that Wallace was breaking the rules, so he remained free to continue his killing spree. That same article, written by staff writers Henry Eichel and Eric Frazier, noted that while some Charlotte residents were critical of the police department and their investigation into the other murders, others defended them. Deborah Childers, the mother of Brandy Henderson, said, "I want Charlotte to understand I've lost my daughter just like the rest of these mothers have. But we have to quit fighting about this. Our officers in Charlotte may not have been perfect, but they stuck together and got this man, and that's more than any of these other towns did." Henry Wallace's murder trial began in September of 1996 and lasted nearly 4 months. During the trial, his attorney was public defender Isabel Scott Day. Day hired a social worker from New York named Carmetta Alvarez to provide an inside look at how his childhood might have helped mold him into a man who became prone to violence and murder. For more than 5 hours, she testified to the jury that Wallace had grown up never knowing his father, was beaten and psychologically abused by his mother, Lottie Mae, and then emasculated by his wife, who asked him to support a child that he did not father. During her testimony, Alvarez testified that Lottie Mae Wallace beat her son with extension cords, garden hoses, and toys. The house he grew up in did not have electricity or indoor plumbing, and he was forced to empty the chamber pot they used the bathroom in every morning. He had bowel accidents until he was 12 or 13, and he began molesting neighborhood girls around that age. Lottie Mae worked long hours, leaving her 2 children to parent themselves a lot of the time. She would make Wallace and his sister Yvonne whip each other with switches they brought in from outside. In his initial confession to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, Wallace said he had witnessed a group of older guys gang rape a teenage girl in the woods when he was around 8 years old, and he admitted watching the assault had excited him. When he got to high school, he wanted to try out for the football team, but his mother wouldn't let him. Instead, he tried out for the cheerleading squad. Instead of being ridiculed, his classmates admired his creativity and skill, and he got along well with the other female cheerleaders on the squad. He tried going to 2 different colleges after graduation, but quickly lost interest in academics. He enjoyed working a job as a DJ for a local radio station, but he was fired for stealing CDs from his employer. He joined the U.S. Naval Reserve in 1984, staying in for 8 years. While he was a sailor, Wallace married his high school girlfriend, Moretta Brown, in 1987. She had a child with another man before they were married, and Moretta asked that he raise the little girl as his own. Wallace told the social worker that he'd wanted more children, but Moretta had refused and didn't want to have sex with him once they were married either. He was asked to leave the Naval Reserves after he got charged with breaking and entering. Because he'd had a spotless record as a sailor, the Navy allowed him to leave with an honorable discharge. Moretta left him not long after. He dated other women after that and had a daughter with one of them who was born in September 1993. While he dabbled in drugs when he was younger, he said it was during this period that the drug use spiraled out of control. He had trouble holding down jobs and worked as a cook or crew member at places in East Charlotte like Captain D's, Taco Bell, and the Golden Corral. Wallace's attorney also brought in 2 expert witnesses to testify on the subject of serial killings. One, Colonel Robert K. Ressler from the FBI's Behavior Science Unit, testified he believed Wallace's actions during the murders showed both organizational and disorganizational characteristics, pointing to possible psychological instability. A specialist in psychosocial development, Dr. Ann Burgess, said Wallace seemed unable to separate reality from fantasy. The jury found him guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. He immediately appealed his sentence, but in 2000, the North Carolina Supreme Court denied it. In the years after the murders, Charlotte residents wondered how police did not connect the tie-in between some of the victims and the Taco Bell and Bojangles restaurants. Charlotte Observer staff writer published an article in March 1994 titled, "Restaurants Linked to Crimes Went Unnoticed." A shift leader at the Bojangles on Central Avenue pointed out that employees at the restaurant rarely stayed longer than a few months due to it being an entry-level job. Wallace's girlfriend and 4 of the victims had all worked at the Bojangles, but they went missing or died over a 21-month period. Caroline Love went missing in June of 1992. Shauna Hawk was murdered in February of 1993. Betty Bauckham and Deborah Slaughter were killed in March of 1994. The shift leader did remember seeing Henry Wallace when he would come into the restaurant with his girlfriend Sadie to pick up her checks. Wallace had worked as a manager at a nearby Taco Bell, where he met some of the other victims when they were customers or visiting friends. If you think about it, Henry Wallace, who stood 6 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds at the time of his arrest, seemed to endear himself to strong Black women who were also savvy, independent, and educated. Many of them were seeking higher education and or raising children. Perhaps he saw something of his own mother, Lottie Mae, in them, and this enraged him. Unfortunately, by murdering so many women who were mothers of small children, he left behind a trail of what was to become generational trauma in his wake. While he had been a child from a broken home who grew up feeling lonely and isolated, many of the children of his victims did so as well. Henry Louis Wallace still sits on death row here in North Carolina. In 1998, he married prison nurse Rebecca Torrijos. He is now 59 years old. This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd also like to support the show in a small way, you can buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com, Renee Robertson. Thank you so much for those who have already supported me through this platform. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. Sound editing is provided by Daniel Robertson. Thanks so much for listening.